So our project was done in collaboration with the British Museum. They had lots of data from the internet, TripAdvisor, things like Twitter, but also internal data from things like their audio guides. And the purpose of our project was to try and help them make sense of this data. What could they learn about how people are interacting with the museum, how people are moving around the museum, what are their trips like, things like that, and try and sort of bring some understanding to this kind of massive data that they had. So we had two supervisors, Taha here from the Institute and Colleen from the British Museum, who was really great at feeding into the project, letting us know what would be helpful to the museum, what things they were interested in, where we should target our research. Because our project differs slightly from some of the other ones we've seen presented today in that with this external stakeholder, we had a very specific set of goals and questions that they were interested in and wanted to report back to them on that in a way that was comprehensible and actionable by the museum. So rather than just pursuing kind of abstract questions or things that we thought were really interesting, we wanted to give them something that would be very useful in their working lives. So these are the kind of questions we were looking at. What drives visitor satisfaction? How do different groups within the museum differ from each other? Do they have different interests? Are they moving around the museum in different ways? When they're moving through the museum, is there a better way to manage the crowds? If you've ever been to the British Museum in summer, you'll know it's incredibly busy, and you almost get traffic jams as people flood to go and look at the mummies or the Rosetta Stone, and other parts of the gallery with more esoteric historical artifacts are almost deserted. So we wanted to look into that and help them understand that and think about ways in which they might be able to improve that experience, both for people visiting the museum and for the people working there and managing the museum, trying to deal with these problems. And we also wanted to think about this from the perspective of people visiting the museum by looking at the audio guide tracks and things like that. How are they moving around the museum? Are they looking at the museum and grouping items and collections in a way that's very, very different from the museum, who are all trained historians and archaeologists and things like that, and have a very traditional understanding of what the museum is? Are people coming in as tourists and just looking at it in a completely different way from what they expected? So we dropped a bunch of data from this presentation, particularly things around TripAdvisor and Twitter, because we didn't think it would be that interesting for this crowd, and we already covered a lot of that in our midway presentation. We included that in the presentation we gave last week to the British Museum, which was almost an hour long, but we just wanted to kind of focus on what we thought the highlights were here. So I'll hand over to Naomi to talk about that.
Okay, thanks very much. So the first thing that we started to explore was the relationship between different rooms at the museum. So we know how the museum chooses to classify different rooms, and this is typically around themes and different periods of time. But we wanted to infer from behaviour from the audio guide how visitors mentally classify the different rooms. So, so we began by creating a binary matrix, simply understanding yes or no, did a visitor enter a given room? And we were interested in seeing the connections between these different rooms. Something else we wanted to do was to control for room popularity. So we wanted to upweight the rooms that were relatively less popular and then cluster the rooms to see how visitors visualize the different rooms. So were they thinking about rooms in terms of theme or location or accessibility or something else? So I'm going to give an example here of how we grouped the different rooms. So we can imagine that the different cities on the top are like different rooms in the museum, and the visitors are like the visitors to our museum. And if we know that a certain individual has gone to Paris and New York, we might infer that there's an association between those two different cities. However, we know that lots of people go to Paris and lots of people go to New York, so maybe it's not that useful that I know that two people went to both of them. However, if I know that two people went to Hanoi and Jakarta and they were the only two to go to those two cities, maybe I care more about that relationship and I infer that these two cities are more similar. And I downweight the association between Paris and New York. So we did something similar with our data, and we found something interesting in that people seem to cluster really tightly on a few of these different rooms. So these are the rooms that are looking at the Parthenon, a lot of the ancient Greek sculpture, those kind of things. But they don't seem to be grouping by theme, because there are also Greek rooms on the top floor, but they don't seem to have the same sort of association in their behavior. So it seems that people are clustering more by location rather than by the particular content of the room. This was at a really high level, so we then tried fitting to 4 different clusters, and again we found that accessibility seems to be more important here. So this is the ground floor, and this is the top floor, and there are walkways from here to the other blue rooms and from these blue rooms to here, and the yellow rooms at the top level seem to be treated differently. So it seems that the classification that the museum is using is not the classification that the visitors are using implicitly. So it seems that the top level people are clustering more by location, but as they get more, as we look more deeply, we can see that they seem to be clustering using a combination of behaviors. So we suggested to the museum that if they wanted to facilitate this, maybe they want to feed this into their plans and their various types of tours, which Tim will be talking about in a moment. But if they want to disrupt this, then maybe they want to find ways of enticing people to visit different clusters in the museum. The next thing we wanted to look at is the way in which individuals physically flow through the museum. And anyone who's been there over the summer holidays will know that it gets super crowded and there are certain pinch points. So the museum was interested in knowing where these are. So this map is a representation of all the different walkways between different rooms in the museum. And if I blow up one subsection, we can see that there's a strong association going back and forth in these rooms, but not for these rooms going up here. But we also see that there seems to be a flow, so people seem to go in one direction, but not in the other. And then if we look at this, the Great Hall here, where people pick up their audio guide, we can see that people seem to go in this direction towards the Rosetta Stone, but it's really unlikely that they're going to go up towards the Living and Dying exhibition or across to the Enlightenment. So we suggested that if the museum is interested in encouraging people to use different pathways, they may want to think about different ways in which they can entice people to disperse more evenly around the space, and to find ways to build natural walking behaviours into the audio guide tours, which is something that Tim is going to talk about now.
Yep, so this is just a quick slide of something I'll get back to later. But all of the audio guides have built-in tours that the museum has recommended. So, for example, the top 10 tour, the highlights of the museum, or the classical world, things like that. So this is just some graphs looking at that and seeing how many visitors are actually taking these tours. And in fact, these are a rosier picture than is actually happening, because we're not looking at the order of tours in these graphs, but just whether they looked at anything on these tours whatsoever. And it shows that for most of the tours, people are looking at 1 or 2 objects, but they're not interacting with the tour as a whole. And also that there's very, very little difference among the various language groups that people can look at the audio guides in, which is something I'll talk more about later. But this kind of challenges some of the assumptions that the museum had about how people were interacting with things, and that specific language groups were interested in specific things within the museum. For example, the museum thought that lots of Korean visitors would go and look at the Korean gallery because that's just what they observed anecdotally in the museum. But here we can see that even amongst Korean visitors, the vast majority of them are not looking at any objects in the Korean gallery at all. And even amongst those that do, they only look at 1 or 2 objects before giving up and going and looking at something else. So it was a suggestion of ours that this is something they might want to reconsider, either the routes themselves or making these more prominent or accessible within the app. So for example, things like if you leave a route to go and look at an object, you think, oh, there's something interesting over there, you can then come back to the route. And that's a functionality that's built into the app, which isn't there at the moment. But would you like to continue?
Yeah, sure. So far we've been looking at tours and the connections between different rooms at the museum. The next section is looking just at rooms at the individual level and seeing what predicts the popularity of a given room. So we know how many visitors went to each room from the audio guide set, and the museum intuitively thought that perhaps certain themes are just more popular. So maybe people make a beeline for the ancient Greek sculpture or the ancient Egypt objects as well. But on the left-hand side, we can see that for each theme, there tend to be 1 or 2 popular rooms and then lots of rooms that are more specialist. And we thought instead people might be, better predictor might be the distance from the audio guide room. So this was a better fit, but we can see there are a lot of outliers that can't be explained just by how far the room is from the audio guide pickup. So then we thought stairs might be really important, and we wanted to know what penalty people applied to stairs. So if a room is upstairs, what difference does it make to the likelihood that I'm going to go and visit it? So we applied 3 different parameters for different stair types. There are the really long steps that go from the ground floor up to the main upper floors. There are also mini steps, which are just a few steps, 5 or 6 steps into another gallery. And then there's also a staircase going downstairs to the Africa collection. So we found the optimal penalty for each of the different types of stairs. And we found that people really dislike stairs, but only when they're going up. So when people have to go from the main floor downstairs to the main floor upstairs, that's the equivalent of going through 8 rooms on the same floor without stopping and then deciding that you're going to stop and look at that room. And even for the steps that were really small, which aren't too much of an arduous task, we saw that there was a penalty of 2 rooms. So it was the equivalent of it being 2 further rooms away. But interestingly, when people have to go down a long staircase, they don't seem to be applying any penalty. So even though they will eventually have to come back up, and that's a challenge, they don't seem to mind, and it's easier to just kind of drift downstairs and worry about that later. Okay, I'm now going to pass over to Tim, who looked at how we can cluster different visitors.
So one of the things the museum was particularly interested in was if looking at this data could help break them out of ways of thinking about visitors to the museum that they got stuck in. So often they think about visitors to the museum in things like demographics of age group and country. And we wanted to use the audio guide data to see if there were other patterns emerging more naturally that weren't around these kind of traditional clusters. So what we looked at was what people were looking at when they were in the museum. So here we have just some samples of the time of the percentage of people's visits that they were looking at specific themes. And you can see that there's some quite clear different clusters between all of them. And we wanted to kind of work on this and try and draw out clusters based on what people were looking at, based on their ways around the museum and what they were interested in, rather than prior assumptions that the museum might have about what they were interested in. So here, for example, is a nice little heat map of all the Japanese visitors to the museum, and we clustered them based on the routes they were looking at, so if they were looking at similar objects and things like that. And we did this to try and move beyond this kind of traditional way of looking at it, because we found this was a very, very poor predictor of pretty much every other variable we had, including the length of stay, what they were looking at, how long they spent looking at things. So we scaled this up to all of our data, all 42,000 visitors, and we did it quite simply, just like a Jacquard union of the routes people were making around, so not concerned with the order in which they were looking at, but just what they were looking at. And then we hierarchically clustered this into 4 clear clusters, which is nothing too complicated, but we think this was a really clear way of helping the museum think about visitors to the museum. And we came up with these 4 different classes and some nice catchy titles to kind of give evocative descriptions of these types of visitors, which is essentially grouped around how long they're spending in the museum, which is a better predictor of what they're going to look at, how they're going to look at it, than any of the other data points that we had. And we wanted them to try and think about visitors in this way and try and incorporate this into the way in which they're planning things going forward. So we had a quick summary of findings of things that they might want to think about and things that they might want to improve upon in the future. including changing things in the app, adjusting some of the setups in the way they collect data, and thinking about the ways in which visitors are interacting with these themes. And finally, drawing on lots of Naomi's work, to think about how people are flowing around the museum. Are there simple things that can be changed to either lean into the way in which people are flowing around the museum, tends to be in one direction, going between lots of highlights and things like that, or is this something they want to try and break up? Maybe suggesting that people go to quieter rooms, and this is something, again, that could be built into apps, or simply just having better signage. Like, there's more down here, it's really interesting, rather than kind of just leaving people to discover that themselves, or just following where everyone else is going. Thank you.